Last class, we talked about the modern evolutionary synthesis. After Darwin died, Mendel died, later on, people put their work together because they didn't know each other to combine Mendelian ideas of inheritance with Darwinian ideas of selection and give us what is called the modern synthesis or Darwinian evolution. And for the most part, that's what we learn in our biology classes, at least through high school, maybe even through college, because it's pretty hard as it is. That's pretty complicated enough. And honestly, the modern synthesis is probably good enough for most things in terms of the biological world and understanding evolution. It'll get you a long way. All by itself, the modern synthesis basically destroys the idea of racial traits as a essence of human beings, or even the idea that species come as an essence that never changes, because the whole point of evolution is that everything is always changing and things get combined and recombined in different ways. So the modern evolutionary synthesis will get you a long way. I'll get you almost all the way you need to get to. But in the last 20 years or so, people have discussed if we need what has been called an extended evolutionary synthesis, which would build upon some of the ideas of the modern synthesis, but develop them in new and different ways, and extend them, you might say, or they say. Now, these ideas are a little bit more cutting edge. They're a little bit more debated in the biological community. Some of the biologists are like, nah, we don't need those things. We're good with the modern synthesis. But for understanding human evolution in particular, and from an anthropological perspective, these things are actually pretty important because they reflect in some ways some of the things that humans are particularly adept at and particularly good at. And so they go beyond a little bit what other creatures do. So the elements of the extended evolutionary synthesis, which your textbook discusses, and we'll go through with examples, but I just want to put them out theoretically, abstractly, before we get into each of them, are niche construction, coevolution, developmental plasticity, and epigenetics. As you can tell, these are all long words with many syllables, so we know we're getting really complicated here. Let's try first to understand these things abstractly, and then we'll do examples. Niche construction specifically refers to how organisms are also constantly changing their environment. So we talked about how evolutionarily speaking, we talk about adaptation and adaptive within an environment, but we are also constantly changing that environment. Now, we can see this with some species outside of humans, let's say birds' nests, beaver dams, and lodges, which actually have a pretty large impact on how the environment for their offspring is shaped. But human beings are very good at niche construction. Look at us in this room. We have the temperature controlled. We have no windows. We've constructed a whole environment that is just, to be honest, it's just weird. Humans have never lived in an environment like this with flat floors and carpet. This one, yeah, it's pretty bizarre. We can turn on switches and make our climate different. But what happens within niche construction is if you alter the environment, you may alter the conditions for selection for the next generation. No, we don't need to be all brute force and strong. That's not something that humans necessarily put a value on anymore. And so it alters the conditions or alters the things that people are going to be selected for in the next generation or generations hence. And humans are very great at building and altering the environment and creating different environments. Malaria, for example, we talked about is in part a result of niche construction. People changed the environment because of their agriculture and irrigation practices, and that led to increased malaria, which then led to the anti-malaria resistance developing. So that's an example of that. Then there's coevolution. So we often think about evolution as our own traits as a species and how we're adapting to an environment. But in fact, we are adapting along with all kinds of other species in the environment. And sometimes these species can become very entangled with each other. And the traits that are helping one species adapt are also changing in the other species. We're going to talk about cows, but we could also talk about wheat and corn and various things that are co-evolving with human beings, or even mice, which have spread with us, or deer. They're dependent on each other. Or maybe we don't like each other, but we are evolving together in some ways, and you can't separate out the traits of one species from the other. All right, good. Developmental plasticity. Sounds weird. Absolutely. So we talked about this a little bit in the last class. You can have two people who are genetically identical, let's say identical twins, but if they are raised in radically different environments, we'll talk about altitude, but you could talk about other characteristics as well, heat and cold, food, different things, then they're going to turn out to look different. And humans are actually pretty remarkably plastic. I don't mean we're made of plastics, although increasingly we are because we're ingesting all those microplastics. It turns out maybe not so great for us. But what plasticity means is that we are changeable as based upon the environment in which we are raised. And then there's this one, perhaps one of the ones that I find the most confusing, and I'm not sure, it's perhaps the most recent, is the idea of epigenetics. Yeah, well, this is a pretty cutting edge field of research. We know about genetic change from generation to generation. Epigenetics is what we might call the environmental switches that turn on and off different genes. And it turns out those also can have processes of transmission. And so the conditions in which, for example, yes, the conditions of the womb, different environmental conditions might turn on some of these epigenetic switches, which get passed from generation to generation. So it's not just your genetic code which helps you develop your traits. It's in part a coding for the environment that you were raised in. So again, these are pretty cutting edge, but they do help us to explain some of the ways in which humans can, we change things pretty rapidly. So these are one of the examples of both niche construction and co-evolution is lactose tolerance and being lactose tolerant or not. So this is one of those things that if you're raised again in the United States and you're exposed to many of those drink milk commercials and have a white mustache, you might think that everybody's lactose tolerant. But if you look around the world, 2/3 of the world's people, or 70% of them, are not lactose tolerant. In fact, humans aren't supposed to be. You're absolutely right. We're not supposed to be lactose tolerant. We evolved to not be lactose tolerant. I'd be drinking all that cow's milk all the time. So if you are not lactose tolerant, congratulations, you are in the majority of the world's population. You are how you're supposed to be. No, I'm making that up. There's no right or wrong here. But in certain areas of the world, people started to co-evolve with those cows and other dairy producers and started to drink a lot of milk. And there were various genetic modifications that allowed people to keep drinking milk, what they call lactase persistence, into adulthood, when for others it would just make them sick. How long have people been doing this? Roughly. It's 5,000 years-ish. Yeah, 5, 7, within 10,000, let's say. This is a pretty recent adaptation when people became cattle herders and started to rely mostly on various milks for protein. These adaptations developed. And I give you here two pictures from the textbook. One is some person in Poland and one is some person in Africa. Again, to say that this is not related to the color of your skin, it's related to whether your ancestors were cattle herders or not, or cattle dependent or not. And so if you look around the world, You see a lot of lactase persistence in West Africa, in European areas, although not necessarily as you go eastward. Saudi Arabia again, some parts of Sudan, Ethiopia, over here around Pakistan, for example. But if you get over here into East Asia, that is one of the lowest areas of lactase persistence in the world. There's just not a lot of cheese and milk products in these areas. And so, for example, my wife is of Korean descent, and in her house, there were no cheeses or milk products of any kind. Well, at the beginning there were, but once you got to be about 2 years old, no cheeses. And in my house, there was all this Gorgonzola Italian style cheese. So you can imagine getting together, and then you have this dietary fight. When you have kids, where are they going to be cheese eaters or not? Turns out, at least in my family, they became lactose tolerant. The point of the matter here, though, is that this does not map onto any other trait. It simply means that maybe some of your ancestors, and even if there are also, by the way, there are plenty of lactose intolerant people in these areas as well, maybe as high as 10, 20%. So the drink milk commercials are sometimes misleading to us about how many people are actually lactose tolerant. So this is one of those things that is mostly genetic, although, as I said, it actually can flip around fairly quickly. And some of the East Asian immigrants into places like the United States, it seems to happen even within 1 or 2 generations, even if they don't marry outside of East Asian populations. So it also seems to have an element of what we call developmental plasticity, that if you are raised with milk, you might become more lactose tolerant, but it also has some genetic attributes. I'd like to, though, in terms of developmental plasticity, I thought a good example of this was humans who are raised at different altitudes. I would say that this is an interesting adaptation which happens in 3 different ways. I'm going to give you the example of the Andes Mountains in South America. So I give you this example because that's where I studied abroad as a college student in Quito, and then did my field work in southwestern Colombia. And so I lived at the time for about a year at 10,000 feet of elevation. So the city of Denver is our mile-high city, and people live up there at, 6,000 feet about. On the equator, because it's tropical in the sun, you can actually cultivate things and live at 10, 11, 12,000 feet and grow potatoes and things, which is what the people in my fieldwork area did. They were actually living there. Usually if you're in Colorado at 10,000 feet, it's because you're up on a ski slope somewhere. And we think of Denver as high, but these people often can live at even higher latitudes. Your book gives you also the example of people in Tibet and the Ethiopian plateau. So as people lived in this area, if you were indigenous to this area, you do develop a genetic adaptation to being able to live at high altitude, which gives you higher lung capacity. However, there's also the fact that if you're born in this area, what happens to you if you're born and raised in this area? Even if you're not necessarily genetically adapted, or it goes in tandem with that, if you are born and raised in a high altitude area, your growth pattern is going to be different than if you are raised at a lower altitude area. But the other interesting thing is that even if you move there, like I did for a year, in the first few days, you're going to be gasping for air and barely able to move. But over time, you do adjust to the altitude. Now, I never was able, of course, I'm not going to have a genetic adaptation, and I wasn't born and raised in there, so I'm not going to have those advantages to live in altitude, but it's something that as you move into different areas, humans are developmentally plastic in that way as well, that you can adjust to different conditions. So that's a great example of developmental plasticity. Another example of developmental plasticity is changes in human height. And of course, human height is partly governed by genetics, and we talked about the rules in terms of body shape and height, but there's quite a bit of environmental or social plasticity involved in height. So you can see here that actually the tallest men are these Dutch guys in the Netherlands. There they are, the world's tallest men, and they weren't always the tallest men, but they've grown up in average from 66.7 inches to about 71.5 inches over the last 100 years or so. Now, what are the Dutch doing being the world's tallest men? Why are they so tall? For those of you who've been to the Netherlands, that's like cold climate area. Why aren't they stocky? Why aren't they short? Stocky. What are they doing being all tall like that? You remember what the Dutch were doing with their kids, their babies? It's in pursuit of rest, regularity, and cleanliness. And the Dutch have one of the best healthcare systems in the world and one of the best nutrition systems in the world. And thus, on average, they get to be the tallest in the world, or at least the tallest men. The biggest height gain in men apparently is from the people in Iran. I want to talk about the shortest women. Well, actually, tell us about the shortest women, or what happened to these Guatemalan women? Yeah, so they're still the world's shortest women, but as you can see, over the last 100 years, they are on average have gone from 55.2 inches to 58.8 inches. So getting up there. And most of that has to do with environmental changes, changes to diet and things like that. For some of you, if you maybe have come from an immigrant background where people in the older generations didn't have as much food as we have now. When I look back, for example, at pictures of my parents and my grandparents were undernourished, and so they come over and they're about this tall. And then they have my dad, and he shoots up, even though genetically they were probably basically the same, but because of the different diet that they have this change in height. Interestingly, the people who have made the biggest height gain were the women in South Korea who went from 56 inches all the way up to 63.9 inches. So back in 100 years ago, they were basically about the same as those Guatemalan women, but they really shot up there. Do you think the South Korean women had a larger gain than the Guatemalan women? What could that be? What could account for the difference between, say, why the South Koreans went so much taller and they were once equal to the Guatemalans, and the Guatemalans, yeah, they went a little taller, but not that much. That is also a very good point, that the people, if we were measuring people in the north of Korea, they probably, if I'm going to guess, might be as similar to, or maybe even worse than the Guatemalan people because of what happened in the north versus what happened in the south. Because what happened in the south versus the north? Let me put it to you this way. How many Guatemalan cars have you driven? How many Guatemalan televisions do you watch? Yet if you've driven a Hyundai, a Kia, bought an LG appliance or a Samsung appliance, you know that South Korea is a huge economic powerhouse. And so the average GDP of somebody in South Korea is actually quite high. They're a huge exporter, whereas Guatemala has not been that fortunate economically speaking. And absolutely, it also speaks to the differences economically between what happened in South Korea and North Korea. All right, our textbook also talks about plasticity. So we might talk about plasticity in one direction as if you have better nutrition, you might tend to be in better health and taller and maybe even larger. But we can also have plasticity and social stress. So this can act in a different direction. And what it speaks to is the way in which our environment impacts our phenotype. And so for people who have a large degree of social stress, it can impact how their bodies develop, how much sleep they are able to get. And so we have crafted various social institutions, schools, education systems, hospitals, And how we treat different people based on how we think about them, these social institutions, can actually shape the way they develop. There's a great example in your textbook of the work of Robin Nelson, who does biological anthropology in Jamaica. And she actually was measuring the levels of the biological characteristics of people who lived in different family environments versus certain school environments and how they were growing and adapting in these areas. And it turns out that their bodies can be different based upon the social stress levels that can impact their development. And of course, that brings us back to of epigenetics, where you can have changes in the maternal environment, which in addition to the genetic changes that we know about from the union of egg and sperm, those gamete changes that we talked about, can switch on and off different controllers, which we call epigenetic changes, which is passed down over time. Now, I want to mention something here about these evolutionary changes that happened as people moved to and adapted to different environments, cold and hot, dairy and not, skin reflective and not, and what happened in these different kinds of things. In today's world, let us say that you are a stocky person in a hot environment, or a lanky person in a cold environment. Do you need to biologically change yourself? If I move down or move up or move somewhere where my body type isn't matching my climate, do I need to get worried about my biological changes? No, what do I need to do? I need to buy an air conditioner. I need to buy a heater. I need to use what's in my environment. I don't have to worry about whether it's snowing outside. I don't even know what it's like outside. Doesn't matter. Who cares? Our body shape is unlikely to be changing because of the cold or the hot. If I have low skin reflectance and am melanin deprived and find myself in a tropical environment, what should I do? Wear sunscreen. In fact, almost all of us should be wearing sunscreen, especially on days when we don't realize it because of the snow reflectance. So skin reflectance, you just put on sunscreen. And if you find yourself in an environment where you're not getting enough vitamin D, what should you do? Take vitamin D supplements. And in fact, almost all of us who live in this area are vitamin D deprived. Go to your doctor during January, February, and check your vitamin D levels. And almost all of us get vitamin D deprived in the winter, even though we're of varying skin tone. So go check that out because it's hard to get vitamin D in a climate like this, regardless of your skin tone. What should you do before you eat all that gorgonzola cheese if you're lactose intolerant? Yes. Yeah, take your lactase pills or buy lactase milk. Now you can buy all kinds of things and you don't have to worry. You don't have to genetically change. Just take a pill, deal with it. And so, in fact, because of niche construction, we are changing the conditions of evolution. So we are not evolving in the same way as we were before. It doesn't matter if you were of dark or light skin at a different latitude, just do the right thing and take your vitamin D or your sunscreen and change yourself that way. But niche construction is something that we can use to our advantage. Of course, we are currently involved in a very big experiment of niche construction, and it's called cutting down lots of trees, putting lots of carbon dioxide stuff into the atmosphere and changing the whole world's climate. Whether this is a good idea, we'll find out, but that is currently what human beings have been doing with urbanization and our technologies is a global project of niche construction, which might become an issue, or it is becoming an issue. All right, so big point of this chapter, human variation is rich and complex. Don't let anybody ever tell you that we're all the same. We are all different. We're all different from each other. It's not because we're genetically different, though. We're genetically quite similar, very similar, but we are phenotypically diverse. Those phenotypical adaptations are recent. They are not deep within our history. They are something that came to us recently. Some of them as a result of things that humans in the company of other species have done with their own environment. Lactose tolerance, malaria, different forms of heating and cooling. So the concept of niche construction means that the conditions of selection become different in the next generation based on our own activity. By the way, that doesn't mean that evolution stops. Evolution keeps going, but it just keeps going in a different way. And of course, because of human plasticity, because we're remarkably flexible in different environments and remarkably adaptable. And this occurs within our lifetime, between generations, and over hundreds or thousands of years. And so these variations that we see are actually a lot more complicated than those simplistic notions that people developed a couple hundred years ago, that people came in these biological race categories, and that white people were naturally this, that, or the other, and that black people were naturally this, that, and the other, etc. And all these sorting out of people that people did, people are actually much more and differently varied than that. And many of the important traits that we see don't map onto these old-fashioned race categories. However, big point here, our institutions that we have developed, where people get their health care, how people are educated, where they live, how much nutrition they get, and whether or not you're exposed to socially stress, what we might call racism, does have a biological effect. So just because race is not biologically real, if people think it is real and treat people differently because of that, and people have different resources because of that, then that actually can change their bodies and their development. However, we should have some hope in this, in that because humans are remarkably plastic or developmentally plastic, if we change the conditions in which people are raised, we can also get out of some of these deleterious, these bad biological effects, which might come from social institutions like racism or inequality.